This lesson looks at earlier forms of globalization, such as the Silk Road and the Columbian Exchange, and examines how these forms of globalization differ to the form which we are experiencing in the modern world. Globalization is not a new concept, although our understanding of it has certainly changed over the years. And while some would argue that the word globalization itself should only really be used to describe the process of the past 30 or 40 years, it seems clear that to a greater or lesser extent, different forms of global interconnectedness have existed since the dawn of human history, or at least since humans started to settle and farm land, thereby creating food surpluses, which in turn led to the creation of specialist craftsmen, bureaucrats, and soldiers who were able to look beyond their immediate world and engage with other groups. The first part of this lesson looks at earlier forms of globalization, such as the Silk Road and the Columbian Exchange. It also examines the different globalization chronologies which different globalization theorists have suggested. The second part of the lesson will look more specifically at what distinguishes modern globalization from these earlier forms. One influential globalization theorist, Thomas Friedman, agreed that globalization could be divided into three distinct periods. The first period, 1492 to 1800, focused on the globalization of countries. The second period, 1800 to 2000, on the globalization of companies, and the third period, 2000 to the present, on the globalization of individuals. We'll look at this model shortly as a way into understanding historical forms of globalization. But before doing that, we'll briefly look at what has been described as archaic globalization, that is, globalization which predates Christopher Columbus and his voyage to the Americas. The economist Andre Gunder Frank believed that the roots of globalization can be seen as early as the third millennium before the Common Era, in the trade links before Sumer, modern-day southern Iraq, and the Indus Valley Civilization, modern-day northern India. These roots grew and became more visible and obvious in the Hellenistic period, from around the 330 before the Common Era for the following 300 years. The result of Alexander the Great was not just military conquest, but also cultural influence, as can be witnessed even today through the names of three cities in Turkey, Egypt, and Iraq, which all derive from his name: Alexandria, Troas, Alexandria, and Iskandaria. Trade was widespread during this period, and it is the first time the idea of a cosmopolitan culture, from the Greek word cosmopolis, meaning world city, emerged. The development of the Silk Road, or as should be properly described, Silk Roads, for there were several routes, was another major enabler of early globalization. Starting roughly 2,000 years ago, these land and sea trade routes joined China to Europe, linking Persians, Somalis, Greeks, Syrians, Romans, Armenians, Indians, and many others along the way. While silk from China was the major commodity traded, many other goods were also bought and sold. In doing so, religion, philosophy, technology, as well as communicable diseases went with them. As noted at the beginning of this session, for Thomas Friedman and many others, the year 1492 was a seminal moment in the history of globalization. The contact between the two areas of the world led to the exchange of a wide variety of crops and livestock. To take but one example of how crucial and deep-rooted this event was, take the example of the potato. The first potato did not reach Europe until roughly the middle of the 16th century, but within just 3 centuries, Ireland was so dependent on it that when the crop failed in the 1840s, it caused a great famine that resulted in around a quarter of the population either dying or leaving. The economic importance of the so-called Columbian Exchange is made explicit by Adam Smith, one of the founders of classical economics, who in his seminal Wealth of Nations argued that the coming together of European traders with Native Americans led to the creation of a new division of labour. He specifically mentions animal skins or surplus peltry, which the Native Americans could exchange for blankets, firearms, and brandy. The discovery of huge silver mines in Latin America during this process also had a huge impact on European countries, since the majority of European economies at the time were based on the value of silver, the so-called silver standard, which meant that any change in the value of silver would have a significant impact on the price of goods in Europe. The Economist newspaper notes that historians attribute everything from the dominance of the Spanish Empire in Europe to the sudden increase in witch hunts around the 16th century to the destabilising effects of inflation on European society, thus showing not only the political and social as well as the economic impact of this. The question which we are now going to turn to is why modern globalisation is different to these earlier forms of globalisation. In this regard, one key distinction to be made is between thick and thin globalisation. In a very influential book called Global Transformations, David Held and his co-authors distinguish thin and thick globalisation as follows. They argue that thin globalisation can be characterised by high extensity, low intensity, low velocity, and low impact, while thick globalisation can be characterised by high extensity, high intensity, high velocity, and high impact. What this means is that the reach and spread of both forms of globalisation is far and wide, but contemporary globalisation is faster, more focused, and much deeper than, say, the Silk Road, where the direct impact was actually on a relatively small group of people, the traders who plied the route and the elite consumers who benefited, plus some ancient hoteliers and restaurateurs in between. It seems that the key difference then between contemporary and historical forms of globalisation is the intensity and universality of globalisation, and the fact that it appears to be near universal. As former Secretary General of the United Nations Kofi Annan said, arguing against globalisation is like arguing against the laws of gravity. It is communications and the technological revolution in the form of computer power and capability which has been revolutionary. For example, from a transportation point of view, in a sense very little has changed in the past 50 years. Transatlantic flight times in the mid-2010s are largely unchanged from the mid-1960s. However, as pointed out by Dr. Michio Kaku, today your cell phone has more computer power than all of NASA back in 1969 when it placed 2 astronauts on the moon. This may sound fanciful, but it's true.